Hello and welcome. I'm going to give a little overview of Huber astrology, astrological psychology, sometimes known as astrological psychosynthesis, a little bit of history, inception, invitation into the world of the Hubers, and why this is an absolute stellar form of astrological psychology, its own complete system. It won't cover all the details, but it'll give you a little bit of a taste of where it came from so that you can get into a little bit of the heart and minds of the Hubers and Roberto Assagioli, the founder of psychosynthesis. So a little bit of the history. Bruno Huber and his wife Louise Huber founded astrological psychology. Bruno Huber was a Swiss astrologer and a teacher who, with his German wife Louise, founded the Astrological Psychology Institute in Switzerland. And Bruno Huber began studying astrology in 1947. When Bruno met and married Louise, he also was a student of psychology and philosophy and physics. Louise was deeply involved in the esotericism of Alice Bailey and theosophy. So combining all these influences, Bruno began to research and compare psychological test results against astrological terminology and ideas. In 1956, the Hubers moved to Geneva, set up an Alice Bailey arcane school there. And the most important influence, though, in terms of the development of the Huber astrology, came in 1958 when they moved to Italy to study with Roberto Assagioli, founder of psychosynthesis. So this section is Bruno's words directly, and there's a picture of him with Roberto Assagioli. My destination was Capellona, a small village near Arezzo, I think that's how you say it, about 100 kilometers south of Florence. It was Professor Assagioli's summer residence. The camp for psychosynthesis was scheduled to take place in these extensive grounds. I have to confess that I didn't retain a clear memory of the seminar, which had been the purpose of my trip. The lectures and seminars and the experts from all over the globe have shrunk to a mere shadow, like faded holiday snaps. This evoked a really strong psychic and mental reaction in me was the personality of Roberto Assagioli. His library, in which I spent many a happy hour looking for spiritual treasure, the countryside surrounding the manse, and the surrounding area which I explored with my bike. Roberto Assagioli had no idea what wealth of wisdom he had hidden in his books. Occasionally, he had tried to retrieve one or other of those notes, but had seldom been successful. And therefore, he was very pleased that I had actually found them. He asked whether I mightn't be willing and able to tidy up his books and to collect his various writings. He'd gladly pay for my train ticket home to save me some traveling time. I was very intrigued by the prospect of investigating his writings and not any too keen to pedal along the highways and catch some more sunburn. So I stayed an extra 2 weeks. The result of my bookworm activities so impressed Roberto that he suggested I should stay on and help him to write a book for which the Psychosynthesis Research Foundation in America had been asking for some time. The results of these negotiations with the foundation resulted in both of us, Louisa and myself, being offered a stable position as assistant. It's actually on a note within that, you can go on to the Psychosynthesis Institute in Italy's website and get access to the complete archives. Roberto was quite a legend and would write on little bits of pieces of paper, anything he could really find, backs of scraps to you name it. So what Bruno was speaking about was really gaining access to these libraries that he had of all these papers and documents and esoteric writings, what have you. Moving along. Florence. So in February of 1959, we moved with child and chattel with the help of railway containers. Here were the headquarters of the Instituto di Psychosintesi, I apologize for my Italian, and also the winter quarters of the Assagiolis. In summer, because of the sweltering heat in Florence, they escaped to Capellona, and here we began to lead a totally different life. So much happened within the next 3 years that it'll be quite difficult to recount it all in a semblance of order within the restraints of this brief article. The intensive involvement with Roberto's patients, personal friendships with people from all over the globe, learning and practicing the people-friendly and very successful therapy called psychosynthesis, working under the wings of a truly wise person whose jovial charisma withstood the drag of daily routine and of living and working together. The quite unforeseen possibilities of research into the basic tenets of astrology, which resulted from Roberto's encouragement and support. Being immersed in the world of art, the new and the old town of Florence, steeped in culture, and experiencing a Tuscan way of life in an area, Capelloni in Casentino, which, for the past 4,000 years, has been cultivated with olive trees and vines, and where had lived such significant people. In the Institute, we had two main tasks. We were busy with compiling the textbooks of psychosynthesis. For this, we had to collect the various brochures and essays Astrological had written over the years on a number of psychosynthesis themes and methods. We had to collect them, put them in order, edit and modify them, at times translate them from Italian and German into English, at times augment them from taped interviews or transcripts. That was a lot of work, and Louise and I have to admit and record it here with due thanks, did the lion's share of it. Louise did the lion's share of it. On the other hand, a task arose from Roberto's clinical work. It evolved quite naturally without our having been told to do so. At the time, we called it aftercare, follow-on therapy. Astrological's clients came from all 5 continents for therapy sessions lasting from 3 to 5 weeks. He gave them a daily consultation of about 50 minutes. The rest of the day they spent in our vicinity. They didn't rightly know what to do with their time and were brim full of problems. So we turned into parent confessors and occupational therapists. Quite often Louise had to cook for them, and occasionally they even slept at our house, especially in Capellona. Sometimes the house was so full of necessity we had to develop a form of group therapy, something which at the time was quite unknown in therapeutic circles. All this was, for us, a process of concentrated schooling in psychotherapy. We learned a tremendous lot, discovered new ways of conducting therapy, which we were then able to discuss and share with Roberto. This in turn enriched his budding work. Thus, our days were well filled with these activities, and in the evenings I was more and more occupied with basic research into astrology. It was Roberto Astrological who encouraged me in this. In fact, he almost ordered me to do it, because his own attempts to make sense of astrology had come a cropper, because he found that most astrological literature was full of contradictions and psychologically superficial, issues and kind of restraints and isms, that he was kind of want to say catastrophically inappropriate and helplessly antiquated, these old ideas. I should note that is absolutely the case with a lot of written material. When we're getting through astrology, it's so important to ask, when did they write it? Why did they write it? For whom did they write it? What was the context? So the approach within the psychosynthesis methods of astrology was to actually work with real case client files and real research, try to square it off. I had told Roberto about my research during the Zurich time that about my basic definitions, he thought they were a lot more useful than anything else he'd come across in astrological literature, and he could give me sensible tips for further work. From a psychological point of view, he felt that all people had the same basic abilities based on their common humanity, but each individual was given a slightly different combination of these possibilities and in different proportions, which explained our individuality. He saw our basic potential in the planets and thought that here the relevant definitions could be quite useful. But what was lacking, in his opinion, were reliable and unambiguous rules for interpretation so that we could select the individually appropriate statements for a chart. Which means that for each planet we should be able to determine its effective strength within a chart. But both Astrological's and my own attempts to work this out with the existing rules came to nothing, as the classical rules for the strengths and weaknesses of a planet simply did not coincide with the actual case histories of the individuals concerned. Now this is Louisa's perspective. Bruno then came into contact with Roberto Astrological, who invited us to Florence in 1958 after a short dissociation crisis from the arcane school. We were here to help him to write his book, Psychosynthesis Techniques. In Florence and Capellona, we had enough time to make contacts with interesting people. There were artists from Italy, psychologists from America, people from all over the world who made pilgrimages to obtain help from Roberto Assagioli. Our task was to take care of these people. A group of intelligent young researchers was formed in which we then also practiced astrology. Astrological research, Roberto Assagioli had a benevolent attitude towards this venture. We kept him informed of the newest discoveries and findings of our all-night group meetings, and he was very impressed, particularly by the aspect pattern drawings that Bruno was developing at the time. This is how he came to commission Bruno to undertake some fundamental new astrological research so that this ancient science could finally find a credible place in psychological practice. We not only drew up horoscopes for all participants, but Assagioli made his extensive case files available to us. That was naturally a rich source of information, a productive area for research. He gave Bruno sufficient time for research while I carried on typing up the book on psychosynthesis. Bruno threw himself wholeheartedly into his research work. Bruno had the intelligent group members on his side, as well as Roberto's support. He discovered new things every day and kept the group on their toes with his findings. He motivated them constantly to test out his new discoveries at first hand. We also did the same, and there were critical discussions, doubts, tests, and finally, Assagioli was always there to give us the benefit of his worldly wisdom. Assagioli was at the same time our friend, an affectionate father and helper. He resolved mental doubts, insecurities, or conflicts on the highest mental level. For me, he was the archetypal wise man. He was unbelievably tolerant, benevolent, and highly intelligent. You could never fool him, as he immediately saw through any veil of deception and tore it to shreds. That was his greatest quality. He solved all kinds of problems easily. Suddenly, they disappeared. They were no longer troublesome or important. They were cleared up by his very presence. This healing influence also made him famous as a therapist. That's why so many people came to him after being failed by other psychologists or psychiatrists. He discovered the cause of their crisis and their spiritual development and sorted things out by showing them the laws of the path of spiritual development. His clarity of mind was invaluable for Bruno's astrological research. He could spot and immediately rectify any potential or hasty wrong conclusions of Bruno's research. This was naturally encouraging for us, gave us the security to be more and more convinced of our cause. The knowledge that we had found something that would change the entire world of astrology motivated us to put all our energies into it. Assagioli often said that every young person who felt responsible for the world and its development had to construct their own area of responsibility, and that ours was the field of astrological psychology. We only felt ready for this great task after 3 years of training. With Roberto's blessing, we then felt we had the courage, if not the enterprise. So, that was a bit of a rundown of some of the history and backdrop of the Hubers and their worldly works and love affair with psychosynthesis and, of course, more importantly, Roberto Assagioli. Let's take a look now at, quickly, 3 charts and some of the ideas within Huber method of astrology that kind of ring out more true than perhaps other forms of astrology. First off, 3 charts in age progression aspect patterns. In the Huber method, we primarily use 3 charts when we're working with clients. This is quite unusual in itself because most astrology centers on the one birth chart. Here is your birth chart, and this is my birth chart. And normally we don't have these wavy lines. This is the energy curve on the outside, so this is not a standard Huber chart, but nonetheless, your birth chart is the inherited plan. It is the divine orientation. It's what most people are familiar with when we think of a birth chart. Basically, though, what we can say, if you're looking at an overall plan within a birth chart, is this. The white circle in the center here is not white and clear for no reason. It represents the soul, the Atman, the divine spark, whatever name you want to call it, and we do not draw lines through it to respect that there's this timeless, vastly kind of beautiful yet challenging to understand concept of the soul that is expressing itself in this lifetime. So this is the first layer. This intentionality that's coming out of the chart creates this aspect structure. Considerable amount of research into just this area here before we go racing off to the ascendant or the planets or the signs of the houses is this aspect structure representing the internal wiring of our psyche. And we get into color combinations, shaping, coherence, and you name it. After that aspect structure, we hit the planets, and they represent psychological drives. We have everything from our moon's feeling self to our sun's kind of autonomous will. We all know what Mars does. Mars is our motor drive, that kind of outward masculine drive, if you will. I don't like to use those terms, but that's what you're going to find in the astrological research between a lot of the old books talking about feminine, masculine qualities. So just mentioning it here really briefly, not to hang our hat on it too heavily. There's also transpersonal planets that are represented in purple. And of course we get into Mercury, our communication, our Venus, sense of harmony and aesthetics, you name it. That was just a brief cover off. I wasn't actually trying to speak to the planets there, just that is the third level out in the chart as we work our way out from the chart center, the aspect structure, to the planets. Next, the planets put on costumes, if you will, or get into their signs. So as you can probably see here, my moon is in this red hot sign of Aries. So the planets take on the qualities of these signs, and that's when we, as we would most popularly know within our sun sign columns, my sun being here in Gemini. So that's where that comes from. The next layer out is the final layer, the fifth layer, which is the house structure, and that is where we meet the real world. The first house here starts out what we call the ascendant, which is the eastern horizon when we're born. If you're born in a hospital, you looked out east. In our worldview of astrology, the constellation of Capricorn would be on the horizon. It's not entirely true, but that's how we run these birth charts. More importantly, though, we have 12 houses. The first house deals all with the self, and that's why we hear the terms rising sign a lot within astrology. But there's every house cover across the 12 houses here, covering off every area of life, everything from our second house of possessions all the way to our seventh house over here of relationships, that whole thing. Again, just knowing that there's 12 houses within areas of life that we actually live in, the real world, and how we express these qualities, we have a pattern then that moves its way out from the chart center via this aspect structure, connecting with these psychological drives, these planetary drives, going through the signs, and then finally making their way out to the environment. Let's just move right along. The house chart represents our conditioning and a subjective view of the individual. So what we're saying here is that the environment sees you, therefore conditions you in a different way that can be a different expression than your birth chart. If we look at this house chart here of mine, it's quite different than my natal chart. So we have conditioning and a way of the environment seeing us that's different from our birth chart. It can be good, bad if you want to speak in those pantomimes, but it's a very valuable way of working with the individual because there is a difference between our conditioning versus our kind of inherited birth chart, which is, I don't want to say more of our true self, but it's less of the conditioned version of ourselves. We also use a nodal chart, and this can represent, depending on your worldview, past lives, but your subliminal self, or more importantly, the shadow self. And it can be just a very deep, repressed part of ourselves that we have less conscious access to. It's very important to understand, and that is all I'll say to it at this point, it does bring in, we can sometimes be living in our shadow chart, our nodal chart, more than we realize. So coming to terms with it in a well-researched manner is quite fruitful. Another big component of Huber astrology is age progression. So this is not timings in terms of what's going to happen to you, but it is our own personal life clock. And we can see here at age 0, this hand of the clock starts moving around. Okay? And as it connects with various planets by coming right up face to face with them or forming these what are called aspects, which you'll learn a bit in a foundations course that I offer, our psyche is meeting up with internal kind of realities and is engaging itself at that level. Internal events of the psyche can marry up with external events. What I'm basically saying is that it's not predicting exactly what's going to happen to you, but it is showing to you the internal psyche development. There is a relationship between inner and outer worlds. So I won't get into the full kind of gamut of what age progression does, but it is a very, very valuable tool to look at our psychological, our spiritual development, and our just regular personality development, if you will, by engaging the age progression and working with clients to see at what moments they've experienced challenging placements and give some real context to their kind of unfolding and situation. It's gilt-edged, works very well for what it does. Another big component of Huber astrology is aspect patterns. So we spoke about this aspect pattern being a really big deal in Huber. There's about 45 patterns, and they hold a lot of space within the chart. If you think of the chart being the psyche, these patterns are little nuggets of information that when they show up in the chart, we can really speak to them. They hold a lot of evocative imagery. They're have funny names sometimes, like bathtub, trawler, butterfly, trampoline, the running or dancing figure, this type of thing. So what they mean in a chart is they give different expressions towards the kind of internal motivations of an individual. And an individual with a shield in their chart, they can absolutely defend themselves and will run into situations in life where they will be defending themselves at very progressive levels, and it speaks to this defensive nature, for example, within it. But there's lots of goodies, lots of super mutant powers we can also get out of looking at these patterns within charts as well too. It's a very exciting piece of Huber astrology, actually. One of them that I really enjoy is called ambivalence triangle, and it's quite simple. It acts like a light switch, and what you can see is kind of this tension right here, this opposition, and then it eventually just switches off the individual. So what does this really mean? In this chart, what you're seeing is an individual that has this ambivalence figure in their chart. So it's their sun and their Mercury communicating that needs to basically have an on-off switch to it, this kind of pulsating, I'm either fully on or I'm fully off. And for this individual, it's in the 12th house. Now, you don't know houses yet, but just to give you an idea, 12th house is a place where we regress to. It's a very introverted, reclusive place where we just need to be with ourselves. So, if the sun represents our will, our biggest kind of drive of will and our autonomy, it's a big deal within the charts. That's why we talk about sun signs. If it is has this on the receiving end of an ambivalence finger that switches off, either on or off all the time like a light switch, our whole will be switched off. Why is this important? Well, this is an individual a client that literally has to go away and have her own space and time to be able to do this deep ontological work. She switches off. And you can You can wrestle with this your whole life or become aware of it and see it for what it is, which is a natural state to work through and therefore to embrace in a much more loving manner so that you can understand your motivations, that this is natural and true to you, and do it in more healthier and progressive ways, etc., etc., etc. An acorn doesn't become an apple tree is a common saying. What we mean by that is when we become aware of our unconscious motivations, that I need this deep respite time for myself, this seclusion and just deep processing, then we just work to progressive ways to fulfill that rather than unconsciously being led down into situations where we're making drastic changes in our lives to kind of get this necessary downtime, etc., etc. You can see how this could be a real problem for an individual when it's not fully understood. That was a very quick crash course in terms of Huber astrology, and if I just back the train up, what I wanted to showcase to you was that there is some deep research going on, even in these funny little images of the aspect patterns. They're well researched and we can apply them to real individuals. Getting to know Huber astrological psychology is different than other forms of astrology, and there's many books, quite a bit of research done with it. I would highly recommend studying Huber astrology, and if you're interested in other forms of astrology, horary, electional, mundane, whatever, then do that also. But at a developmental kind of psychological level, I don't think you can beat Huber astrology for the research and the impact it can have in terms of allowing you to understand yourself better and also work with clients in a very inclusive and progressive manner. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you very much, and I hope this gave you a little bit of insight into the Huber method of astrology.